Greene here, and I am so excited today to talk about Daniel B. Greene's new novella, Breach of Peace. Daniel was nice enough to send me an ARC, and even with that, I've already purchased and pre-ordered the physical copy so I could have it in my collection. Before I get to this review, I just want to say that I am so thankful for Daniel Greene and his presence on YouTube. He is the reason I found BookTube, probably like most people. I saw him and actually Murphy Napier's video about adult fantasy in different tiers, and I thought, oh, that's fun. Let's see what else this guy and Murphy had done. And then probably again, like most of you, I binged a lot of their videos and been watching ever since. And I thought, hey, I'd like to talk about books, and now I'm here. So thank you, Daniel, for that introduction. And I should also say, very specific to me, once I was able to get, a little bit of a following, not like Daniel's, but a little bit, I thought, hey, I can start sharing my writing with the world, and this might be a good platform just to see what people think about my creative world. And so on my Patreon, which if you haven't checked out, you can still check out, I've been releasing short stories. And that's because Daniel has inspired me to do that and be vulnerable. So thank you doubly, Daniel, and thank you so much for sending me this book. Now, that said, I respect Daniel enough as a reviewer that I am going to review his book like I would with any book that I review here on the channel, view it with a critical eye, talk about it in light of my own tastes, and even treat him not as someone that I know intimately. We're not even really that close of friends. We've emailed back and forth and commented, that kind of thing. But I wanna try to be as true to myself as a reviewer of possible. So from this point on, to help signal that, I'm gonna call him Greene like I would with any author using the last name instead of the first name. Let's talk about this book, Breach of Peace. Now, if you don't follow Greene's channel, he has talked about the plot a little bit, but if you're not aware of it, it's basically a murder, not necessarily mystery, but a murder takes place in the first act of this little novella, and it's the inspectors in this world that are trying to figure out what is happening. The world is, I would say, closest to a Flintlock fantasy type feel. At least that's what it felt like to me. Urban fantasy for sure. In this world that is ruled by a literal god. Well, I guess we don't know if he's literal or not, or a human that just kind of disguises him. Everyone just calls this person the Almighty. We don't really see a lot of this in this novella. It's a shorter book, so we don't get all the details of the world. But in this world, there is the military, which is kind of like the very strong, sort of mysterious force. And then under that, I guess that's debatable, is like the police force. And so we're with the police force, not only as they're trying to figure out what's going on with this murder, but also sort of how it situates within this larger empire and the politics going on in the empire. First things first, some positives about this book, because I really liked it, is Greene is a really easy author to read. It's just a smooth reading experience. I would say he probably comes from the school of a Brian McClellan or a Brandon Sanderson as far as how he chooses to write. It's just smooth is the best word for it. It's easy to turn pages, turn pages. Probably like the best endorsement I can say is that I read this in a day and I wasn't planning to. And I didn't feel overburdened by it. I didn't feel like I was straining at all. I just kept reading. I would finish a chapter and say, hey, I want to know what happens next. And I kept reading. I was very comfortable. I didn't switch between books as I sometimes do when I need a break from books. I just read it basically from cover to cover with one break where I had dinner and watched a show with my wife and then came back and finished it. So it's so easy to read. And like I said, I really do think Sanderson fans and Brian McClellan fans, and from what I hear, Brent Weeks fans, are really going to feel familiar and comfortable with the writing style. And the prose are the same way. They go down very, very smooth. It's not overly descriptive. It's not incredibly detailed with character looks or even the world building itself, but it gives you what you need to sort of understand and imagine where you are in this world. And it's quick without being clip, if that makes sense. Some writers, you understand these shorter sentences, but it gets to you how brief the descriptions are. Greene's book is not like that at all. Smooth, again, I'm coming back to that word a lot, trying to describe more than that. But it's easy to read, but you don't feel like you are losing anything because it's easy to read, if that makes sense. The world is incredibly intriguing. I already mentioned Brian McClellan, especially the only Brian McClellan I've read is the Powder Mage trilogy, and this novella reminded me a lot of that world. So if you're a fan of that series, I think you're going to love this series. If you saw my review, or maybe I did a wrap-up on it, I wasn't like a massive fan of that series, but that's because I felt like it was bloated and directionless, and both of those things are definitely not the case in this little short novella. It is incredibly focused, it knows exactly what it wants to do, and it's taking you on the story, which I really enjoyed. Also, the nice thing about murder mysteries is there's a clear goal, there's always sort of a clear purpose in the writing. And I think Greene was very smart in his first published work to go with a story like that that has a very clear push of the story. I should also say, this book has some, when I'm talking about tone and I talk about Sanderson-esque or McClellan-esque, one thing I appreciated about Greene's writing is that he doesn't wear kid gloves at all. There are some moments that are honestly horrific in the sense of being verging on horror. The crime itself is grisly, and Greene does not pull out from the details. He zooms in, he lets you know what you're working with. The action and how some characters die or how some characters are injured is brutal, is noticed. You feel it. As people know who have seen some of my reviews of the Cosmere, I sometimes get on Sanderson for not making violence as sort of gross and in your face as it could be, and that somewhat glorifies it. Greene does not glorify violence at all, even though there is a lot of violence in the book. And I really appreciated that tone, that it is that smooth prose that I think makes Sanderson, McClellan, Weeks really popular and really appeal to a wide variety of people. And yet, he doesn't lose any of the edge while he does that. I haven't ever read any Stephen King, but from what I hear, a lot of people say that that's kind of how it's like for reading Stephen King. I'm not a huge horror fan, but I had no problem with this book. So those are my positives. Now let's get to some critiques I had of this work. My major sort of overarching critique is this is billed as a novella, and in my reading, it's not really a novella, more like the first third of a novel, if that makes sense. When I hear novella, I think that it is a small story that is going to go pretty quick and have an ending. It's hard for me to have a conception of novella as the first in a trilogy, and when I read this, I kind of knew that going on. I was a little nervous about that, and I think my fears were, well, they weren't fears, but my hesitations were justified, because it felt to me like it was just the first part of a novel. And so there's not as much of a conclusion and a satisfaction at the end of this that I feel like I would at a normal story. That said, I'm incredibly intrigued, and I'm really excited to read the second book in this trilogy, the second novella in this trilogy. So in that way, I guess it is very successful. My guess is if Greene either chooses to get a publisher or continues to self-publish this, after they are all out, these will probably be, for most of history, bound together as a single work in like 3 distinct parts. Very much so like The Once and Future King is 4 books, but really everyone just reads it now as 1 book. I think probably at the end of this trilogy, it's going to turn into just 1 book with 3 parts that were published separate from each other. It's not a huge problem, but I do feel like there's not the satisfaction that I wanted with the ending. Secondly, the world building, while intriguing, I didn't feel like it blew me over. I didn't feel like I got enough to really get the entire feel. At the beginning of this, I was like, oh, it's kind of urban and flintlock, and I know there's guns, and I had some vague thoughts on the world building. Part of that is I don't want to give any spoilers, but also I didn't think the world building was as expansive as it could or maybe should have been for what Greene was trying to do in the book as a whole. And normally, actually, I might not have even mentioned this because it's hard to world build in 160 pages, and it's short, I understand that. But I just read P. Jelly Clark's Black God's Drums, which I think is shorter than this book, but its world building is immense and powerful and really all-consuming, and really it was some of the best I've ever done. So I think that might have been to the detriment of Greene as I was reading this, because I was thinking back to how the word economy in Black God's Drums was basically perfect, where here it wasn't bad, but it definitely wasn't perfect. And I think there could have been more of the wider world or a couple more sentences of descriptions of certain things, in my opinion. Finally, talking about the smooth prose, overall, I do think that is a plus, but there were moments where I wished Greene would sort of let himself run a little bit more wild in the descriptions. I think it seems purposefully many times he doesn't tell us a lot, leaving a lot to the imagination, which sometimes works, but if you do it too much, it feels to the reader like you're not given enough, that you lose the visual. And at times, Greene is so good at painting a picture, particularly around the crime scenes. In multiple places in the book, the crime scenes are described in such beautiful, gory detail that I understand the weightiness of it, the grossness of it, and that draws me in. There were other times, in one time in particular that I won't talk about because it's somewhat of a spoiler, where I just wanted more description and he didn't give it to me, and that kind of hurt that particular scene in part, in my opinion, because I didn't get enough to really visualize or really understand the peril of the main characters. Again, I think this is probably this is his first work as an author, so as he grows, I think he'll get better at picking and choosing those moments to put in more detail without losing the smoothness of the prose as a whole. But really, at the end of the day, I'm going to highly recommend this. I've really appreciated recently reading smaller fantasy works, and I think this fits in just perfectly in that genre. I am going to give it a long endorsement. Now, the only reason it's not a universal recommend is because it's harder for me for these shorter works to bump things up higher. It's the same reason that Black God's Drums is just a universal recommend, not best of all time. In such a short amount, you just don't get the emotional beats and the feels normally to really get to that upper echelon, but I really enjoyed reading this. Like I said, it's literally a one-day read. I think with the enjoyment and the smoothness of the prose, I'd recommend getting it. I'm gonna have a link both in the description and in the comments for you to pre-order that. You can pre-order it on Kindle or the physical copy, which I got and I'm super excited to get, but highly would recommend. If you haven't yet, check out my Patreon. I have, like I said, my original stuff on there, also some behind the scenes stuff, deleted scenes, outtakes, that kind of thing. Also, like, subscribe, you know, all that jazz. Thank you guys for watching. As always, first in, last out.